There's a ton of reasons why working digitally makes being an illustrator so much easier. That said, working digitally makes it so easy to make your work look like hot trash. The good news is there's some simple things you can do to avoid making your work look like look like a bad drawing, bad illustration. In this video, I'm gonna share 5 tips. Actually, I think there's more than 5, but 5 is better for a title. That'll help you to keep your work looking great and getting you some illustration work, or just making better drawings digitally. Let's talk about them. All right, tip number 1. Digital illustration gives you so many possibilities. There are millions and millions of different kinds of brushes that emulate all different kinds of techniques. There's different effects you can do. There's gradients, there's blurs, all kinds of stuff. My tip is to not get caught up in the infinite possibilities that you can do, because oftentimes when you combine these different things, it tends to look bad. When you're drawing something that looks like it's hand-drawn and then you're pairing it with like a blur or like a gradation, they just sort of look terrible together, and it highlights the fact that it's digital. I think it's bad because it's like distracts from the work. It's making the person think about how the work was made as opposed to like just looking at the illustration. Because it's like, I'm used to seeing gradations and like this kind of work, but I'm used to seeing like printmaky hand-drawn stuff like this, and now I'm seeing them together, and they're thinking about that as opposed to like the story or what you're trying to express or the characters or whatever. That's not to say that there aren't ways that you could blend these different things, and maybe that's a look you want to go for where you're sort of merging these two worlds. Rules are made to be broken. I'm just saying, you got to know the rules to break the rules, and you got to be really good to break these kind of rules, because it's tough to make gradients look good with some like hand-drawn stuff. And that sort of leads me perfectly into the next point, which is finding the brushes that work for you. You don't need a ton of brushes. You should find the ones that do what you want to do and sort of maybe stick with those. You can experiment with different things, but if you're constantly messing around with different brushes, you don't really get the chance to sort of master your craft or figure out the way you do things, and you end up spending all this time trying to figure out brushes as opposed to working on the drawing itself. One of the hardest things for me when I transitioned from working traditionally to digitally many years ago was finding the right line work brush. For my work, line work is very important, and I just felt like I couldn't get that natural line that I was getting with the sign pens that I was using in my traditional stuff. So I would do all my line work, scan it in, and then color it digitally. And what I found was that there were lots of brushes that were close to what I wanted, but they maybe had like more taper, or they're a little bit more dramatic. And I discovered that you can make some simple tweaks to existing brushes to get them to be perfect for you without knowing a lot about brush dynamics and how they work. For me, it was as simple as just going into the settings and turning down the pressure sensitivity for how much the line weight would change in the line. And doing that, it made it much closer to what I was used to, and very quickly allowed me to seamlessly transition into working fully digitally. And I gotta say, once I was finally able to do that and cut out that part of my work where I was doing all the drawing and then having to scan it in and then color it, saved me so much time and made me so much more efficient. A little side bonus with the brushes is the brushes can be overwhelming. You can have so many brushes, and it can take a while to find the ones that you want if you're using a ton of different brushes. So what I recommend is just spend some time going through and picking out the brushes that you use on a regular basis, and then like put them together in a little set. Ow, hit my elbow. If you're using Fresco, you could do this by simply just favoriting, putting the little star thing next to the brushes you like, and then they just show up in your favorites. This is not meant to promote my own brush pack, but the only reason I actually went through and picked out all of the brushes that I use on a regular basis and organize them was because I put together my set for Retro Supply Co. Otherwise, I just would have been working in chaos. With the ADHD, I can't focus and do all this stuff, but man, now that I have them all organized into the different categories of brushes for that Retro Supply Co set, it makes my life so much faster. I've got like a drawing category. I just go in there, grab the brushes that I use. I've got the coloring, the texture, all those different things, and they're all organized, and it makes it so much faster. You could check out that set below, but this video isn't about that brush pack, but it does exist, so I am obligated to talk about it. So if we're talking about working digitally, I have to talk about resolution. This is one of those things that is very confusing for a lot of people, and I get it. It can be confusing. My tip is to make sure that you work in a high enough resolution more so than you would need to print. That said, it goes further than that. So let me just try to break down resolution in an easy way. So there's lots of different variables when it comes down to image resolution. And it's not as simple to just say you have to work at 300 DPI or PPI. I'm sure you've heard that before. The reason is because DPI stands for dots per inch, and we're working digitally. So if your file size isn't set in inches, that 300 DPI doesn't mean anything. Like if your image size is set in pixels, which is like the default for Fresco or Procreate or something like that, the resolution, it needs the inch part for it to mean anything. Otherwise, it's just talking about dots per inch when there's no inches involved. The reason there's a discrepancy is because screen resolution requires less pixel density to look good than does something that needs to be printed. For example, you may have downloaded an image off of the internet that looks great on your screen, and then you print it out and you notice it's all pixelated and you're like, what the heck, it looks fine on the screen. It's because the screen doesn't require as many pixels to look great. So the standard accepted resolution for something that's going to be printed is 300 dots per inch. So if you were making something that you wanted to print at 10 inches by 10 inches, you would set up a file that's 10 inches wide by 10 inches tall, and then the resolution would be 300 DPI. If you then change that to pixels, that would be 3,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels. Each inch has 300 pixels. That is simple enough, but let's say you're working on something smaller. Like let's say you get hired to do a spot illustration for a magazine, and it's only gonna print at like 4 inches wide. 4 times 3 is 1,200 pixels. So if you set your file up with only 1,200 pixels wide, the image is gonna be really small, and you're not gonna have a good time drawing at that size because there's not as many pixels, so you're not gonna have good enough brush control. So what I do, I'll set the dimensions for what the project's gonna be, and then I just bump the resolution until it gets to be like above 4,000. For me, 4,000 is sort of like my starting point for the amount of pixels that I like to work in that gives me the most control over my brushes. Because when you have less pixels, if you try to zoom in a little bit, things are all blown out and pixelated. You can't have as much pressure sensitivity when there's not as much pixels there to accept that brush or whatever, you know, the shape, the dots. You need more dots. So if you're working in a bigger image size like that, and the aspect ratio is still the same, you can likely just send it as is. Having higher resolution is not gonna be a problem, but you could always downsize it afterwards. The thing about print resolution when you're working in pixel-based brushes is that you can always go smaller, you can't go bigger. Technically, the application will let you make it bigger, but it's just gonna be trying to figure out what pixels are there because they didn't exist and like making their own. And it's gonna look weird. It's gonna have those like digital artifacts. It's not gonna be great. So you always wanna work much bigger than you're gonna need, or at least at the proper size. You may be thinking to yourself, well, why not just work in vector? If you're someone who uses Adobe Fresco or like Adobe Illustrator, you'll know that when you work in vector, it's resolution independent. So what that means is that instead of using pixels, all of your artwork is made out of like magical math. It's points and paths connecting those points. So when you scale, that just recalculates. So it's infinitely scalable. You could print it really tiny or the size of a building. It's gonna look flawless. It's not gonna lose any resolution because it's independent of resolution. But that doesn't mean it's a magic bullet and you should just always work in vector. Vector artwork is limited. Because it's made in points and paths, you can't get that like really analog handmade look with vector artwork. Like you can do some stuff with texture and vector, but for it to look really natural and really good, it's gonna take so many points, and it can be a very, very tedious image, and it's not great to work in. Like you won't have as much brush control as you would with a high resolution file and pixel-based brushes, because working in pixel-based brushes is as closest as you can get to just like drawing marks on paper. With pixel-based brushes, you got this pressure sensitivity, and you can have a brush that like emulates a pencil or like paint, where it's like fading out and like very super pressure sensitive. you can't really do that with vector brushes because it's putting down points and paths for every little thing. So in order to get something that looks that real, let's just say it's pretty much impossible. It is impossible for nearly everything. That doesn't mean you can't make vector artwork that has some texture and grit. It's just you're sacrificing a bit for that. Something that I get asked about a lot where it's like, oh, I need vector artwork because I'm making shirts or stickers or this or that. In most cases, you don't need vector artwork. Sometimes a company that's printing something will say, or like a client will say, we want vector artwork, but really all they're doing is trying to just protect themselves. And they're used to working with people who might not know what they're doing, so they know if they send vector artwork, they don't have to worry about that resolution issue. For example, I've had plenty of times where someone will request vector artwork and I'll say, hey, does it really need to be vector? Like if I provide a high-res file, is that gonna work? Very often, almost always like, oh yeah, that's fine. It doesn't need to be vector as long as it's like, high-res, maybe they need layers or something like that. Really, the only time that vector is almost always required is if it's some sort of like branding or logo project or some sort of like packaging that needs to be adapted to other things, or if it's like a very specific use case where it's something that's going to be like engraved or cut out or something like that. Otherwise, it almost never needs to be actually vector. The next two tips kind of go together. The first one is to zoom out often. One of the things that tends to happen when people are starting out, they tend to zoom way in and just do all this like tight detail in every area of their image. They're just sort of working and they're not zooming out and getting a feel for the whole image. You want to zoom out a lot, get a feel for that whole composition. If you get obsessed with being zoomed in, working on these like little areas one at a time, the whole image is going to suffer. You want to be looking at the whole thing. Work, 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 zoom out, get a feel for everything, and then decide where you need to go. The second part of this is you gotta be careful when you're zoomed way in drawing, because you could get lost and not realize how deep you are zoomed in and just doing the tightest little detail. And then you get this just a super artificial, hyper rendered look that is most cases weird and just kind of looks crazy. It also makes it so that there's no real like focal point in the image. It all just feels too tight and it's hard to look at. What I like to do is set like a minimum brush size for an illustration. And it's not like a manual setting where I'm saying this is the brush size and limiting it. I just sort of look and say, okay, this line work looks good when I'm looking at the image full size. So I don't want to go smaller than this. So I just sort of make a note in my head. It's like, okay, 12 point is my minimum brush size. And then it doesn't matter how zoomed in I am, if I don't move my brush past that minimal size, I'm not gonna be able to do anything when I'm zoomed in that far because the brush will be too big. And I'll be like, oh, this is a good reminder that I'm way too far into the composition. So I highly recommend this one. It's a good one, which I guess is the next thing in that don't draw everything with the same amount of detail. I talked about this a little bit before, where if everything is all tight detail, there's no depth, there's no focal point, there's no nothing. Everything is just like all there. And you don't know where to look at. It's not very enjoyable for the eye. Maybe do some stuff where there's no outline, and like maybe you focus on some areas where like there's a lot of detail on the important parts of the image, but things that aren't important, like maybe background elements or something like that, has less detail and just sort of maybe falls back into the atmosphere, if you will. It's very easy when working digitally to get super caught up in detail and just zoomed in and hyper focusing on little areas. I get it, but try to think about that focal point, and doing the constant zoom out situation is a great way to do it. Hopefully these tips will help you in your work. Did any of these resonate with you? Are you guilty of any of the things I talk about here? Do you think I'm a big dummy and my ideas are stupid? Let me know in the comments, because these are just my ideas of what I think works. You may have different opinions. I'd love to hear them. Anyway, loosely touched on vector artwork and the reasons why you might use it, the reasons why you might not use it. Maybe that's something you want to know more about. Check out this video. I go into a lot more detail about that. If you're still confused about the resolution thing, check out this video because I explain it in this one. possibly a little bit better, possibly more confusing. But anyway, good talk. I'll see you soon. Thanks.